The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Atlanta International Airport as travelers rushed to their gates. Among them was Dr. Andrew Wilson, his shoulders slightly hunched from the weight of his backpack after 3 long days at an aerospace engineering conference. He wore a simple navy sweatshirt, jeans, and comfortable walking shoes, practical clothes for the 6-hour flight back to Seattle. Andrew checked his boarding pass again, Flight 2187, first class, seat 3A. He'd used his frequent flyer miles to upgrade. After presenting his days of research to hundreds of colleagues, he just wanted some extra legroom and a quiet place to nap. The gate agent called first-class passengers to board. Andrew stepped forward with his ID and boarding pass. The agent glanced between his face and the documents, hesitated for a beat too long, then forced a smile. "Enjoy your flight, sir," she said, her tone carrying an unspoken question. Andrew had heard that tone before. It was the sound of someone trying to figure out if he belonged where he was trying to go. After 15 years as one of the few black engineers in his field, he'd gotten used to it. As he made his way down the jet bridge, Andrew mentally reviewed the presentation he'd given on advanced hydraulic systems in commercial aircraft. His designs had been implemented in several major airlines over the past decade, making flights safer for millions of passengers. "Welcome aboard," said the flight attendant at the door, her smile dropping slightly when she saw him. Andrew nodded politely and turned left toward first class. He found his window seat and tried to lift his laptop bag into the overhead bin. The compartment was awkwardly positioned, making it difficult to reach. A flight attendant with Brenda on her name tag passed by. Andrew caught her attention with a small wave. "Excuse me, could you help me with this bag? The bin is a bit high." Brenda's smile tightened. "Of course," she said flatly. She took the bag with 2 fingers as if it might be dirty and shoved it roughly into the compartment. As she walked away, Andrew heard her mutter to another crew member, "People who don't usually fly first class always need extra help." The other attendant, a man with thinning hair and Tom on his badge, snickered. Maybe he won a contest or something. They hadn't bothered to lower their voices enough. Several nearby passengers heard the exchange. An older white woman across the aisle caught Andrew's eye and frowned sympathetically. Andrew took a deep breath and settled into his seat. He'd learned long ago that confronting such behavior usually made things worse. Besides, he was too tired to deal with the drama or the inevitable "we didn't mean it like that" excuses. A businessman in an expensive suit took the seat beside him, nodding briefly before immersing himself in his phone. Andrew pulled out the safety card and studied it out of habit. As one of the engineers who helped design emergency protocols, he always paid attention to safety features. "Can I get you a pre-departure beverage?" Tom asked the businessman next to Andrew, completely ignoring him. "Scotch, neat," the businessman replied without looking up. Tom turned to walk away without taking Andrew's order. Andrew cleared his throat. "Excuse me, I'd like some water, please." Tom turned back, surprised, as if he'd genuinely not seen Andrew sitting there. "Right. Water. I'll be back with that." 5 minutes later, the businessman had his scotch. Andrew's water never arrived. As the final passengers boarded, Andrew gazed out the window at the ground crew loading luggage. He recognized the model of the hydraulic lift they were using to load cargo. He had helped improve its safety mechanisms 3 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same people who designed the planes, improved their safety, and kept passengers alive often weren't seen as belonging in first class by the very crew members whose jobs existed because of their work. Andrew put in his earbuds, closed his eyes, and prepared for what he hoped would be an uneventful flight home. He had no way of knowing just how wrong he was about that. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Andrew opened his eyes, having dozed through takeoff. His throat felt dry. He still hadn't received the water he'd asked for. The businessman next to him was already tapping away on his laptop. Across the aisle, the older woman who had given Andrew that sympathetic look earlier was flipping through a magazine. The cabin hummed with the white noise of conversations and the steady drone of engines. Andrew pressed the call button above his seat. A full 2 minutes passed before Tom appeared, looking slightly annoyed. "Yes?" he asked, not bothering with "sir" or any other pleasantry. "I never received the water I asked for before takeoff," Andrew said politely. Right, Tom replied. We got busy with the departure. I'll bring it now. 5 minutes later, Tom returned with a plastic cup of water, not the glass tumbler the other first-class passengers had received. He practically dropped it on Andrew's tray table, causing some to splash onto Andrew's sleeve. Sorry about that, Tom said without sounding sorry at all. Andrew dabbed at his sleeve with a napkin. No problem, he said, though it clearly was. The meal service began shortly after. Brenda worked her way down the aisle, starting from the front. Chicken or pasta? She asked each passenger with practiced cheerfulness. Her smile never wavered until she reached Andrew. We have chicken left, she said flatly, not bothering to offer a choice. Andrew noticed that several passengers after him were still given options. The businessman beside him received his meal with a flourish. Here's your pasta, sir. Would you like some fresh ground pepper? More wine, perhaps? When Andrew's tray arrived, last among all first-class passengers, the chicken was barely warm, and his request for coffee was forgotten until he asked again. Through it all, Andrew maintained his composure. He'd faced worse in his career. During his Air Force days, he'd had commanding officers who made these flight attendants look friendly by comparison. He'd learned to pick his battles. Halfway through the meal, Andrew overheard Brenda talking to Tom in the galley. They weren't being particularly quiet. Can you believe they let just anybody into first class these days? Brenda said with a snort. Back in my day, people dressed properly. Had some class, you know. Tom laughed. Maybe he's some rapper's bodyguard or something. Andrew stiffened but continued eating. The woman across the aisle caught his eye again. She leaned over slightly. Don't let them get to you, dear, she whispered. Some people are just awful. I'm Martha, by the way. Andrew, he replied quietly. And don't worry, I've heard worse. That doesn't make it right, Martha said firmly. She was in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind stylish glasses. I was a teacher for 40 years. If my students had behaved like that, they'd have been in detention for a week. Andrew smiled, genuinely this time. It felt good to be seen as a person. After the meal, Andrew pulled out his laptop to review some documents. He was working on a new emergency landing system that could help pilots maintain control even during catastrophic hydraulic failures. The math was complex, the engineering even more so. He lost himself in the work, barely noticing when Brenda collected his tray without a word. An hour into his work, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. Nothing serious, just enough to make the cabin shudder slightly. Andrew paused, listening to the engines. Something about the pitch didn't sound quite right to his trained ear. He tilted his head, focusing on the subtle harmonics that most passengers would never notice. Was that a slight flutter in the left engine? He couldn't be sure. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Folks, we're experiencing a bit of turbulence. Nothing to worry about, just some rough air. We should be through it shortly. Flight attendants, please take your seats until we're clear. Andrew frowned slightly. He knew the difference between turbulence and mechanical issues. What he was hearing wasn't just rough air. Something else was happening with this aircraft, something subtle but concerning. And he was probably the only passenger on board who could tell. The turbulence passed, but Andrew couldn't shake his concern. The subtle vibration in the floor beneath his feet wasn't normal. Neither was the faint whine he could hear beneath the usual engine noise. After 15 years of testing aircraft systems, he knew when something was off. Andrew put away his laptop and focused on listening. He pressed his palm flat against the window, feeling for vibrations. Yes, there was definitely something wrong with the left engine. Small, rhythmic shudders came through the fuselage, invisible to most passengers but clear as a warning bell to him. He glanced around. No one else seemed worried. The businessman beside him was now sleeping, mouth slightly open. Martha across the aisle was watching a movie on her tablet. The flight attendants had resumed their service, moving through the cabin with drinks. Tom passed by, avoiding eye contact. Andrew raised his hand anyway. "Excuse me," he said firmly. Tom paused, clearly annoyed. "Yes." "I need to speak with the captain or first officer. There's an issue with the left engine." Tom's eyebrows shot up. Then his expression shifted to something between amusement and condescension. "Sir, I can assure you everything is fine. The captain just explained it was turbulence." It's not turbulence, Andrew insisted. I'm an aerospace engineer. I design these systems. Something's wrong with the left engine. It could be a compressor issue or a problem with the hydraulics. Tom's smile became tight. Sir, I think we know how to do our jobs. The pilots have decades of experience. If there was a problem, they would know. Not necessarily, Andrew said. This is subtle, but it could become serious very quickly. Please just tell them. Sir, Tom cut him off. Please don't disturb the other passengers. Everything is under control. Andrew took a deep breath. Getting angry wouldn't help. Could you at least pass along my concerns? Tell them Dr. Andrew Wilson from West Coast Aeronautics thinks there might be an issue with the left engine compressor. Tom's expression made it clear he had no intention of doing any such thing. I'll be sure to mention it, he said in a tone that meant the exact opposite. He walked away, shaking his head. A minute later, Andrew saw Tom and Brenda talking in the galley, both glancing his way and smirking. Brenda rolled her eyes dramatically. Andrew could read their expressions clearly, just another passenger thinking he knows better than the professionals. Martha leaned across the aisle. Everything okay, dear? Andrew hesitated. He didn't want to scare her, but his concern was growing by the minute. Just noticed something about the engine that doesn't sound right. Tried to tell the flight attendant, but he wasn't interested. Martha frowned. That's not right. Would you like me to try? Sometimes they listen to little old ladies. Andrew smiled despite his worry. Thank you, but I don't think it would help. They've made up their minds about me. The vibration was getting worse. Andrew could now feel it in his seat, a rhythmic tremor that was unmistakable to him. He pulled out his phone and opened a note-taking app. If they wouldn't listen to him, he'd document what he was observing. Maybe it would help later when things escalated. He typed quickly. Left engine showing signs of compressor stall. Rhythmic vibration at approximately 3 Hz. Slight pitch deviation in engine sound. Possible hydraulic fluid leak based on change in control surface response during last turn. Just as he finished typing, the plane banked slightly to the right. Andrew felt the controls respond sluggishly. The aileron adjustment was delayed by a fraction of a second, not enough for most people to notice, but to Andrew, it might as well have been a blaring alarm. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, sounding carefully casual. Folks, we're going to be adjusting our altitude a bit to find smoother air. Flight attendants, please return to your seats for a few minutes. Andrew watched as Tom and Brenda exchanged glances before strapping themselves in. Neither looked concerned, but the captain's tone told Andrew everything he needed to know. The pilots had finally noticed something wasn't right. The businessman beside Andrew woke up, blinking sleepily. Are we there yet? He mumbled. No, Andrew said quietly. But things might get interesting soon. As if responding to his words, the plane suddenly shuddered more violently. A few passengers gasped. The left engine's pitch changed dramatically. A sound like a car engine trying to turn over but failing. The cabin lights flickered once, twice. Now people were noticing. Nervous glances were exchanged across the cabin. A child started crying somewhere in coach. Andrew looked out his window at the left wing. What he saw made his blood run cold. This was no longer a minor issue, and they were still at least an hour from the nearest airport. The left engine was now visibly struggling. Through his window, Andrew could see uneven bursts of flame, not the steady, controlled burn of a healthy jet engine. The metal housing around it vibrated unnaturally. Dark fluid was trailing behind it, hydraulic fluid, just as he feared. Andrew unbuckled his seatbelt, his body moving before his mind fully processed what he was doing. Sir, you need to stay seated. Tom called out from his jump seat near the galley. Andrew ignored him and moved toward the cockpit. Whatever was happening, the pilots needed to know exactly what they were dealing with. The plane dropped suddenly. It felt like an elevator with its cables cut. Passengers screamed as they were lifted against their seatbelts. Unsecured items, phones, tablets, cups, hit the ceiling. Andrew grabbed a seat back to steady himself. The overhead bins popped open and bags tumbled out. A flight attendant who wasn't strapped in fell hard into the aisle. Just as suddenly, the plane stabilized, but now it was tilting to the left. The damaged engine was losing power, creating an imbalance in thrust. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a bang that made several passengers scream again. The cabin filled with the sound of rushing air as the plane lost pressure. "This is your captain," a strained voice announced over the intercom, barely audible over the noise. "We are experiencing a mechanical issue. Please remain calm and put on your oxygen masks. Remember to secure your own mask before helping others. Brace for possible turbulence." The calmness in the captain's voice was professional, but Andrew knew they were far beyond a mechanical issue. This was a full-blown emergency. He made it to the front of the first-class cabin just as Brenda was rising from her jump seat, her face pale with fear behind her oxygen mask. She placed a hand on his chest to stop him. "You cannot go to the cockpit. Return to your seat immediately." The plane lurched again. They both stumbled, bumping into the bulkhead. "Listen to me," Andrew said, his voice muffled through his mask. "You have hydraulic failure and an engine that's about to give out completely. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilson. I designed the emergency systems for this exact aircraft model. The pilots need my help." Brenda's eyes widened with recognition, then disbelief. "Yo? What?" The intercom crackled again. This time it was the first officer, and he wasn't trying to sound calm anymore. "If there is anyone on board with commercial or military flight experience, please identify yourself to a crew member immediately." Brenda's hand fell away from Andrew's chest. She stared at him, her earlier contempt replaced by shock. "You're serious?" "Deadly serious," Andrew replied. "Every second counts." The plane banked hard to the right, the pilots compensating for the failing left engine. Somewhere in the cabin, a child was crying. An older man was praying out loud. "Tom," Brenda called out, her voice shaking, "get the cockpit on the line. Tell them we have Dr. Wilson from West Coast Aeronautics," Andrew supplied. Former Air Force pilot, specialized in emergency systems for this aircraft type. Tom's face, previously flushed with annoyance whenever he looked at Andrew, was now ashen. He fumbled with the cabin phone, his hands trembling as he called the cockpit. A moment later, he looked up at Andrew. "They want you up front. Now." The lead flight attendant appeared, her professional demeanor cracking under the stress. "Follow me," she said to Andrew. As they moved toward the cockpit, Andrew felt the plane's flight controls becoming increasingly sluggish. The hydraulic systems were failing fast. Without those systems, the pilots would have almost no control over the aircraft's movement. Inside the cockpit, alarms were blaring, not just one or two, but a cacophony of warnings. Red lights flashed across the instrument panel. Both pilots were fighting with the controls, their faces slick with sweat despite the cool air. The captain, a gray-haired man with 4 stripes on his shoulders, glanced up as Andrew entered. "You're the engineer?" "Yes, sir. Dr. Andrew Wilson, former Air Force. I helped design the emergency backup systems for this aircraft." The first officer, younger and visibly shaken, shot a desperate look at Andrew. "The hydraulics are gone. Engine 1 is failing. We've lost most of our control surfaces, and the backup systems aren't responding. We're trying to divert to Bellington Regional," the captain added, "but I don't know if we'll make it. She's not responding to inputs." Andrew leaned between them, scanning the instrument panel. The situation was even worse than he'd thought. But there was one thing they might not know about this particular model. "There's a tertiary backup system," Andrew said. "It's not in the standard manual because it was added after initial certification." For the first time since the crisis began, a flicker of hope appeared in the pilot's eyes. "Tell us what to do," the captain said. For the first time since the crisis began, a flicker of hope appeared in the pilot's eyes. "Tell us what to do," the captain said. Andrew steadied himself against the violent shaking of the cockpit. The captain, whose name tag read Captain Reynolds, kept a death grip on the controls while the first officer, Lieutenant Chen, frantically worked through emergency checklists. The tertiary system was added after 3 similar failures in testing, Andrew explained, speaking rapidly but clearly. "It's not connected to the main hydraulic lines, which is why it's still operational." He leaned over the center console, scanning the switches and buttons. "There," he pointed. "See that unmarked panel below the climate controls?" Captain Reynolds glanced where Andrew was pointing. "That blank panel. There's nothing there." "It's hidden," Andrew said. "My team designed it that way so it wouldn't be accidentally triggered." He pressed firmly on the bottom right corner of the blank panel. With a click, a small compartment popped open, revealing a keypad and a single red switch protected by a clear cover. Lieutenant Chen's eyes widened. "I've been flying this model for 5 years. I had no idea that was there." "Only the newest models have it," Andrew explained. "And it's only mentioned in the supplemental emergency manual, not the standard flight deck documentation." The plane lurched again, dropping several hundred feet in seconds. In the cabin behind them, passengers screamed. Andrew grabbed the back of the captain's seat to keep from falling. "We're running out of time," Captain Reynolds said through gritted teeth. "What's the code?" Andrew's mind raced. This system was his design, implemented after a year of testing. The code was 3-14-15-9, Andrew said, the numbers coming back to him. "It's the first 6 digits of pi." Lieutenant Chen punched in the code with trembling fingers. The keypad lit up green, and a computerized voice announced, "Emergency backup system activated." "Now flip the switch," Andrew instructed. Captain Reynolds reached over and flipped the red switch. For a moment, nothing happened. The alarms continued blaring, the plane continued shaking. "Did it work?" Lieutenant Chen asked, panic edging into his voice. "Give it a moment," Andrew said, watching the instrument panel intently. Then gradually, some of the red warning lights on the dashboard began changing to amber. The violent shaking of the aircraft eased slightly. The plane was still in danger, but the nosedive had leveled off. "It's working," Captain Reynolds said, his voice tight with concentration. "I've got minimal control back on the elevators and rudder." "The system bypasses the main hydraulics," Andrew explained. "It won't give you full control, but it should be enough to maintain altitude and direction until we can land." Lieutenant Chen was already on the radio with air traffic control. "Burlington approach, this is Flight 2187 declaring an emergency. We have partial hydraulic failure and engine 1 is critically damaged. Request immediate vectors for approach and emergency services standing by." The controller's voice came back immediately. "Flight 2187, Burlington approach. Cleared direct to the field. Runway 27 is clear and ready. Emergency services are being notified. Wind is 270 at 12 knots. Captain Reynolds glanced at Andrew. "Can you stay in the cockpit? Your knowledge of these systems might make the difference." "Of course," Andrew nodded. He strapped himself into the jump seat behind the pilots. The next few minutes were tense as Captain Reynolds fought to maintain control of the damaged aircraft. The backup system provided just enough responsiveness to keep them stable, but the controls were sluggish and unpredictable. "Burlington Airport in sight," Lieutenant Chen announced finally, 15 miles out. Through the cockpit windshield, Andrew could see the airport in the distance. They were going to make it to the runway, but landing would be another challenge entirely. The tertiary system wasn't designed for landing procedures, Andrew warned. It's meant to keep the plane flying long enough to reach an airport. "What do you suggest?" Captain Reynolds asked, never taking his eyes off the horizon. Andrew thought quickly. "You'll need to come in higher and faster than normal. The flaps won't deploy symmetrically with the damage we've sustained. And the landing gear." He moved forward, checking another instrument panel. "The landing gear indicators are showing inconsistent readings. We might have a partial deployment." "Belly landing?" Lieutenant Chen asked. "Not necessarily," Andrew replied. "Let me think." He closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the aircraft systems, running through the backup procedures in his mind. "There's a manual override for the landing gear," he said finally. "Lieutenant Chen, you'll need to lift the panel under your right knee. There should be a hand crank there." Chen found the panel and the crank. "Got it. How many turns?" 32 clockwise for full deployment, Andrew said. "And you'll need to put your back into it. Without hydraulic assistance, it's going to be like opening a stuck window." As Chen cranked the handle, sweat pouring down his face with the effort, Captain Reynolds addressed the cabin. "This is your captain speaking. We are 15 minutes from landing at Burlington Regional Airport. We are experiencing technical difficulties that will make our landing more challenging than usual. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened tightly. When we give the signal, take the brace position as demonstrated by the flight attendants." His voice was remarkably steady, masking the dire situation they faced. Andrew looked back at the instrument panel, calculating their chances. With the manual landing gear deployment, the tertiary flight control system, and 2 skilled pilots, they had a chance. A small chance, but better than they had 5 minutes ago. Behind them, Brenda opened the cockpit door. "The cabin is secured, Captain. Everyone is strapped in and ready." Her eyes met Andrew's for a moment. The contempt was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. "Good," Captain Reynolds replied. "Now brace yourselves. This is going to be the hardest landing of my career." Burlington Regional Airport grew larger in the cockpit windshield. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, their lights flashing urgently against the afternoon sky. The control tower had cleared all other traffic, giving Flight 2187 priority access to the longest runway. 8 miles out, Lieutenant Chen announced, his voice tight. "Landing gear shows 3 green lights. We've got full extension." "Could work," Andrew said. The manual crank had left Chen's hands raw and blistered, but it had worked. Captain Reynolds spoke into his headset. "Tower, this is Flight 2187 on final approach. Be advised we have minimal flight control response and will be coming in hot." "Understood, Flight 2187, the controller responded. Runway is clear. Winds holding steady at 270 at 10 knots. Emergency crews standing by." Andrew leaned forward between the pilots. "The tertiary system will give you about 40% normal response on the elevators. You'll need to start your descent earlier and more gradually than usual." Captain Reynolds nodded, beads of sweat rolling down his temples despite the cool air in the cockpit. "Understood. Chen, give me flaps 10. Chen moved the flap lever cautiously. The plane shuddered as the flaps partially extended. "Asymmetrical deployment," Andrew warned, watching the indicators. "Right side is only at 7 degrees. "I can feel it pulling," Reynolds confirmed, adjusting the rudder to compensate for the uneven drag. Through the cockpit door, Andrew could hear Tom instructing the passengers. "Brace. Brace. Heads down, stay down." The runway threshold was now clearly visible. They were coming in too fast, much faster than a normal landing. Without full flaps to create drag, they couldn't slow down sufficiently. "We're going to eat up a lot of runway," Reynolds said grimly. Andrew quickly calculated distances and speeds in his head. The tertiary system can handle one more thing. There's an emergency brake assist, but it will only work once we're on the ground. He pointed to a blue button near the throttle controls. "Hit that button the moment the wheels touch down. It will divert all remaining hydraulic pressure to the brakes." "What about manual braking if that fails?" Chen asked. "Won't be enough at this speed," Andrew replied honestly. "But let's focus on getting the wheels down first." The plane crossed the airport boundary. They were still 200 feet above the ground, descending rapidly. 500 feet, the automated system announced. 400. Reynolds had his eyes fixed on the runway. His hands were steady on the controls despite the enormous pressure. Chen monitored the airspeed and descent rate, calling out numbers. 300 feet, 200. Andrew gripped the edge of his seat. In the cabin behind them, 211 people were in the brace position, waiting for impact. 100 feet, 50. "Ready on the brake assist," Reynolds instructed. 40, 30, 20. The wheels hit the runway with a violent jolt that shook the entire aircraft. The right landing gear touched first, causing the plane to swerve dangerously. "Now," Andrew shouted. Reynolds slammed the blue button. The effect was immediate. The plane lurched as the emergency braking system engaged, pressing everyone forward against their restraints. A horrible screeching sound filled the air as the tires fought for traction. The left engine, damaged beyond repair, finally gave out completely with a series of loud pops, sending sparks flying behind them. "Stay with it," Andrew encouraged as Reynolds struggled to keep the plane centered on the runway. They were eating up asphalt at an alarming rate. The end of the runway was coming up fast, too fast. "We're not going to stop in time," Chen said, panic edging into his voice. Andrew spotted a control that might help. "The emergency arrestor gear. It's that red handle under the radio panel." Chen reached for it, yanking the handle down with all his strength. Hidden panels on the underside of the aircraft's wings popped open, deploying small drag chutes that added crucial resistance. The deceleration pressed them all forward again as the plane's speed began to drop more rapidly. Still, it wasn't enough. They were 3/4 down the runway, still moving at over 100 miles per hour. "Reverse thrust on the right engine," Reynolds commanded. "Full power." Chen pushed the right throttle forward, then yanked it back past the idle position into reverse. The right engine screamed as it changed direction, trying to push the plane backward even as it rolled forward. The combination of brakes, drag chutes, and reverse thrust finally began to win the battle against momentum. The aircraft slowed, but the end of the runway, marked by red lights and a grassy overrun area, continued to approach. Andrew watched the distance markers counting down. 2,000 feet remaining, 1,000. The plane shuddered and groaned under the strain of emergency braking. Warning alarms blared as systems overheated. 500 feet remaining, Chen called out. Just when it seemed they would run out of runway, the plane's speed dropped below 20 miles per hour. Reynolds guided the limping aircraft to a stop with just 100 feet of concrete to spare. For a moment, the only sound in the cockpit was the heavy breathing of 3 men who had just stared death in the face and survived. Then Captain Reynolds reached up and flipped a switch. "This is your captain speaking. We have landed safely at Burlington Regional Airport. Please remain seated until further instructions. Emergency crews will be boarding to assist with evacuation." He turned to Andrew, his hand extended. "Dr. Wilson, I don't know how to thank you." Andrew took the captain's hand, feeling the firm grip of a man who now saw him with new eyes. "Just doing my job," Andrew replied quietly. Both of them. The emergency slides deployed with a loud hiss. One by one, passengers slid down to the tarmac where emergency crews waited to help them. Despite the terror they'd just experienced, the evacuation was proceeding with remarkable order. Andrew stood near the cockpit door, helping the flight attendants direct people. He'd insisted on staying aboard until everyone else was off the plane. The left engine was still smoking, though firefighters had quickly coated it with foam to prevent a fire. This way, he called to a mother struggling with 2 small children. "Let me help you with that." He took the younger child, a little boy no more than 3, and carried him to the exit. The mother looked at him with tear-filled gratitude. Tom and Brenda were at the forward exit, guiding passengers down the slide. Neither could meet Andrew's eyes directly. The confidence and superiority they'd shown earlier had vanished completely. Captain Reynolds emerged from the cockpit, emergency logbook in hand. He patted Andrew on the shoulder. "Ground crew says the left engine's main housing is cracked right through. If we'd stayed in the air 10 more minutes, it would have torn off completely." Andrew nodded. "That's why I was trying to alert your crew earlier. I could hear the harmonics changing." Captain Reynolds' face darkened. "So I've heard. We'll be addressing that." He looked toward Tom and Brenda meaningfully. Martha, the elderly woman who had been seated across from Andrew, approached. "Young man, I just wanted to thank you before I go down that scary-looking slide. That was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced, but somehow I knew we'd be all right when I saw you go up to the cockpit." Andrew smiled. "Thank you for your kindness earlier. It meant a lot." "Nonsense." Martha waved her hand dismissively. "Basic human decency shouldn't be something to thank people for. Now, how about some help for these old bones? I'm not sure this slide was designed with 78-year-olds in mind." Andrew and the lead flight attendant helped Martha to the exit, where a firefighter was waiting at the bottom to catch her. As the last few passengers exited, Brenda approached Andrew hesitantly. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Dr. Wilson," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to apologize for how—" "Not now," Andrew cut her off, not unkindly. "Let's get everyone safe first. We can talk later." Brenda nodded, swallowing hard. Once the final passenger had evacuated, the crew prepared to leave. Lieutenant Chen went first, then Tom, looking back at Andrew with a complicated expression of shame and gratitude. "After you, Doctor," Captain Reynolds said. "Captain's traditional place is to leave the ship last," Andrew replied. Reynolds smiled tiredly. "I think we can make an exception today. Go on." Andrew slid down to the tarmac where news crews were already gathering behind police barriers. Paramedics were checking passengers for injuries, but remarkably, there were only minor bumps and bruises. The airport manager, a tall woman in a crisp uniform, was waiting at the bottom of the slide. Dr. Wilson, I'm Director Powell. We've been informed of your role in bringing this aircraft down safely. On behalf of Burlington Regional Airport, thank you. Andra accepted her handshake. Happy to help. The pilots did the real work. That's not what they're saying, Director Powell replied. They're saying you're the reason 214 people are alive right now. Before Andra could respond, reporters began shouting questions. Dr. Wilson, how did you know something was wrong with the aircraft? What went through your mind during the emergency? Is it true the crew initially ignored your warnings? Andra raised his hand for quiet. I'd like to make one brief statement, then I need to check on the other passengers. The cameras and microphones pointed toward him eagerly. What happened today was a team effort between the flight crew, the pilots, and myself. In emergency situations, expertise matters more than appearances or assumptions about who belongs where. I hope if anything good comes from this experience, it's that we all learn to look deeper than surface judgments. He stepped away from the microphones despite the reporters clamoring for more. He spotted Brenda and Tom standing with the other flight attendants watching him. Andra walked over to them. The other crew members stepped away, sensing a private moment was needed. I'm so sorry, Brenda said, tears in her eyes. The things we said, the way we treated you, there's no excuse. You judged me based on how I looked, not who I am, Andra said simply. It happens every day to people who look like me. I've never been so wrong about someone, Tom admitted, his face flushed with shame. You saved our lives after we treated you like I didn't belong, Andra finished for him. That's the point, isn't it? None of us know what others carry inside them, their knowledge, their experiences, their abilities. We only see the surface. Will you be filing a complaint? Brenda asked, her voice small. You should. We deserve it. Andra considered this. I think today was lesson enough. But I will be talking to your airline about better training. A commotion near the terminal caught their attention. A corporate helicopter was landing, bearing the logo of the airline. Executives were clearly rushing to manage the situation. Looks like your bosses are here, Andra observed. I should go. Dr. Wilson, Tom called as Andra turned away. Thank you. Not just for saving us, but for the second chance. Andra nodded. Make it count. As he walked toward the terminal where passengers were being processed, people began to recognize him. A spontaneous round of applause broke out, spreading until everyone, passengers, airport staff, even the emergency crews, was clapping. Andra Wilson, the man who wasn't supposed to be in first class, had become the hero of Flight 2187. And somewhere in that crowd, perhaps someone was learning to see beyond appearances for the first time.